Hi and welcome to this last video in our series about learning theory. This video is about social constructivism. So let's start with an overview. Social constructivism started out in the early 1900s. Learning is here seen as first social and then individual, and it always happens within a culture. Social processes shape both our learning and our thinking. Since we are part of a culture, we don't have to start learning everything from zero. We use tools to learn and think, both physical and mental. Some of the key figures here are Vygotsky, Dewey, Kolb, Lajv, and Wenger. Social constructivism has a base in constructivism, but there are some clear differences. Constructivism sees learning as following development as the learner acts on their environment. So first we develop to a certain stage, like biologically, and then we can learn as we act on the environment. But social constructivism sees it the other way around. Here, learning is seen as leading development. So by learning, we get triggered to then develop further. And learning is here seen as something that occurs as the learner engage in social activities together with others. Social constructivism is actually a bit of an umbrella term. It is not one cohesive theory. There are many theories that fit under this umbrella, and we will now go into some of the larger ones. You can think of it like a tree where we will look at some of the larger branches. Okay, let's start out with Sociocultural Theory. And here we find Lev Vygotsky. He was born in 1896 in what at the time was the Russian Empire and that then became the Soviet Union, where he then died in 1942. Sociocultural theory has three main parts: cultural environment and collective memory, mediation through intellectual tools, and socialization with others. Let's start with cultural environment and collective memory. Okay, so we are all part of a cultural environment, and our knowledge is part of our culture and our history. And that is remembered by the collective. The cultural environments have a collective memory. The knowledge is kept both in our memories, but also in artifacts like books and technology. And not only us as persons evolve, but the whole culture evolves. This means that we, as individuals, we don't need to redo everything. Each individual don't have to start from zero, since they will learn from being part of a culture. When you learn something, you can make it your own. You incorporate previous generations' knowledge. Vygotsky called this that you appropriated the knowledge when you were making it your own. So for example, each individual doesn't have to reinvent a new language. Through the culture they are part of, they can appropriate an existing one that's been evolved over 1,000 of years. So knowledge is here seen as collective and not as something that is created by one single individual. Then we have mediation. So mediation is the use of tools in socially organized activities. The idea here is that we interact with the world through the use of tools. It helps us to reach further and be able to do things we otherwise couldn't. So a basic level would be like physical tools, like a hammer, a stick, glasses and such. But then we also have psychological tools, like symbols, language, or counting. Psychological tools helps us understand and interpret the world, not just interact with it. They can also help us with having a smaller cognitive load, to connect it back to cognitivism. Then we have some things that are both physical and psychological tools, like a phone or a scale, where the scale can physically help us find out how much something weighs, but it does this through a representation of a system for weight that we came up with, and that's a psychological tool. Other humans can also be mediators. Say that you need to reach something up on a high shelf. You could then use a physical tool like a chair, or you could try a psychological tool like language by asking someone to reach it for you. But asking for help only works if there are another person available. It's the other person that makes it possible to reach the object. So the other person becomes the mediator that helps us reach the object through another mediating tool, language. In behaviorism, we talked about how a stimuli will trigger a response. Here, we add the layer of cultural tools. So it's seen as that when the stimuli comes in, we interpret it through our cultural tools before responding. And that is also what is described as the difference here between humans and animals, that we have these cultural tools, and not just the physical ones. The last thing is about how this theory views how we learn. And here it is the social interaction that is highlighted. In sociocultural theory, we also find the idea of the ZPD, the zone of proximal development. You can see this as 3 areas. You have what we already know and can do without help, say a child that can do basic subtraction. Then we have possible knowledge, the knowledge that we can reach with the right support, maybe multiplication in this case. And then we have what we can't do yet even with help, in this case maybe advanced algebra. And the zone of proximal development is the middle one. It is what you can do with help from a more knowledgeable other. And the more knowledgeable other can be both a peer or a teacher. In the zone of proximal development, you can use scaffolding. This is a well-used teaching method where you support the individual student and then gradually remove the support. So you can take a bigger problem that should be solved and break it down into smaller achievable steps that then can be solved with less and less support until the student can solve each part on their own. And then you show them how to put it together to solve the larger problem. Sociocultural theory in many ways never became a full-fledged theory. It is widespread and many people have built on Vygotsky's ideas to try to develop it further. But there are also a lot of misunderstandings and contradictions in relation to Vygotsky's ideas. And there are reasons for that. Vygotsky died young at the age of 37 of tuberculosis, and in the West he was pretty unknown before he died. Because of the Soviet era, his ideas never got the chance to be read by other thinkers outside of the Soviet Union before he died. The first translation of his works to English didn't happen until 1962. If that had happened while he lived, that probably would have affected the ideas and made him iterate and develop them further, and also giving him the chance to explain some parts in more detail. Okay, so let's move on to the next larger branch. And here we find pragmatism. This comes from John Dewey, an American. And you have probably heard about this. Learning by doing? That's pragmatism for you. The idea here is that you learn a lot more by doing than by just reading about it. And this is often used in relation to role-playing games and LARPs. Pragmatism highlights practical use and engagement. So knowledge is something that should be useful here and now. It needs to have a practical use. Teaching shouldn't be abstract. If you learn something in the classroom, what you learn should be something that you can go out and use at once. Otherwise, it's really not that relevant. So no teaching of the kind, this will be important for you to know when you are an adult, according to the old pragmatism. Engagement is also seen as very important. You need to have an active concern about the problem you're looking into. So this means that what you teach needs to be relevant to the students. It needs to be meaningful. You can't make something interesting by just adding something fun. It needs to be interesting and relevant for the students to start with. Dewey said that we should learn through inquiry. This can be seen as an almost research-like approach. You see a problem, you try to figure out why it's a problem, you try to come up with solutions to the problem, you try them out, and you find hopefully a satisfactory solution. You have then learned along the way and know more the next time you run into a problem. So learning here is not seen as only about the subject knowledge. Learning is interdisciplinary, and a lot of focus is on learning the process, which then leads to the knowledge. If we look at this in relation to cognition, from a cognitive perspective, we talked about how engagement and feelings leads to more hooks, and that is good. And that matches pretty well with what I said here. But we also talked about how beginners and experts learn differently. So from a cognitive perspective, this would be seen as a really good way for experts to learn, but not very good for beginners. So here you once again see how the different perspectives can view learning and teaching differently. From pragmatism, we later got another theory that is used a lot in relation to role-playing games. Experiential Learning by David Allen Kolb. This can be seen more as learning through reflection on doing. And Kolb is mostly known for his learning cycle, where you start out having a concrete experience, then you do a reflective observation where you are reviewing or reflecting on that experience. You then have abstract conceptualization, where you are concluding or learning from the experience on a higher level. And then you have active experimentation, where you are planning or trying out what was learned. And then you are back having a new concrete experience. So for example, if you play a leader in a LARP, and after the LARP you talk about and reflect on how it was to play a leader. You then think about what parts seem to work on a more general level. And then you try to implement this when having a group assignment in school. And then you get a new concrete experience. When we are talking about this in relation to role-playing games, usually we don't talk about or do a lot of the active experimentation phase. Maybe we should. Here I also want to note that pragmatism and experiential learning can be seen as a clear criticism of more classical lecturing. For example, in the zone of the proximal development that we had. And Vygotsky talked about having standard classes, but he also talked about play and how that is important, which makes it relevant for us. But this means that even if sociocultural theory, pragmatism, and experiential learning all are social constructivist theories, they do not necessarily agree with each other. So also within the same family of theories, we have different views. Okay, now we come to situated learning with Jan Leiv and Etienne Wenger. Okay, so the learner takes part in a social context. Knowledge exists within communities and a specific context. And to be able to access this knowledge, the learner needs to become part of the community. Legitimate peripheral participation leads to membership in a community of practice, as they would say it. What does that mean? Okay, let's break it down. Legitimate. That means you are supposed to be there. You are not someone that just happened to walk into the wrong room. Peripheral. That means that you are not yet a part of the community. So maybe you are new to a role-playing group that has been playing together for a while in a system you don't know. So you are legitimate since you are invited and supposed to be there, but you are still peripheral in the group since you are new and don't have the same knowledge. A community of praxis means a social situation or context where certain ideas are held as true or seen as useful. So what is useful knowledge in one time, place and community might not be that in another. Situated learning question transfer effects. This connects to what I talked about in the Learning in Praxis video, about how we are bad at using knowledge from one context in another. And since the situated learning perspective sees learning as something happening in a specific context and community, that leads to questioning transfer effects. And just to be clear, this doesn't mean that this perspective believes that nothing can transfer, but that transfer effects are seen as very weak, and that we therefore should learn what we need in the context where it is to be used. So this is actually very much an opposing view to constructionism. Learning in school and out in the world are here seen as very different, and this perspective is not very easy to apply in formal education. This perspective can be seen as closer to the master-apprentice model. So, for example, working with internships. Just like for all the other theories, there is also critique. What is usually highlighted when it comes to situated learning is that it makes you very locked into a certain work or knowledge domain. Focus is on learning for and in a very specific work environment. So instead of teaching, let's say, the higher principles about computer programming, you should learn one specific code language so you can use it at once at the workspace. Preferably even learn it at the workspace. But what happens then when that code language no longer is used? This critique is also relevant for pragmatism, that highlighted that what we should learn should be useful should be useful here and now, and we shouldn't learn something else. Collaborative learning. This is often used and mentioned in relation to role-playing games and learning. It is rooted within the social constructivist umbrella, since it's about learning together. And in collaborative learning, the group takes responsibility for the learning process together. It is not one of the big theories in the same way, but is rather slightly further down on the branches. But it can be combined with pragmatism, with situated learning and experiential learning, for example. And the reason I mention it is because it might be interesting for you if you want to look deeper into this on your own. And this is a word that can help you in searching for relevant research, and it is very relevant for role-playing games and LARPs. To finish off, I wanted to show you a timeline on when these different ideas that we talked about in this video happen, because they are very spread out, and it can be good to have an understanding of that, since when they came up affects what they contained. So first out was Dewey. From Pragmatism. His My Pedagogic Creed came out in 1897. Then we had Vygotsky from the Sociocultural Theory. His Thinking and Speech came out 1934, translated in the 60s to English. Then we have Kolb from Experiential Learning, Towards an Applied Theory of Experiential Learning, that came out 1974. And the newest is Lev and Wenger, Situated Learning. That came out in 1991. And these, just like the other larger theories that we have talked about in this series, have also evolved in many different directions, and there are many different versions of them out there. Even if the theories presented in this video sometimes have different approaches to some parts, there are two central ideas that the social constructivism theories share. The first that they share with constructivism actually are that one, the students are active in constructing their own knowledge. And the second is that social interactions are important in the process where knowledge is created. And with this, we conclude our little series about learning theories. I hope you have learned something new and that you got to see how they all have their pros and their cons. And remember that you can, and probably do, use parts from all of these theories when teaching. These are ways to think about and relate to learning and teaching. They are not dogmas to be followed. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something.